On this podcast, we've covered well over 170 crazy true stories, and several of those have been about animal attacks. I've had guests on who have been attacked by a rattlesnake, large dogs, an alligator, a monkey, a grizzly bear, an elephant, yellow jackets, and a shark. But we've never talked to a victim of a tiger attack until today. Ironically, John was working in Russia as part of a conservation effort to protect tigers and other wild cats when this happened. And the only thing he had to protect himself from the lunging tiger was a road flare. Real people in unreal situations.
There is a girl hanging by her broken leg from the telephone wire.
And I called 911 and I said, I found a baby.
I turned around. I see a gun pointed at me close enough I could touch it.
She would hold our heads on the water all the time.
He levels the gun, pulls the trigger, and I go down.
Her eyes were full of tears. She didn't want to leave us.
My hair catches on fire.
I swear to God, this image is burned in my head for the rest of my life.
I'm Scott Johnson, and this is What Was That Like? When this happened, you were director of something called the Siberian Tiger Project. What was that?
Yeah, so the Siberian Tiger Project was a project capturing and radio tracking Siberian tigers for the purpose of collecting ecological and population data on tigers that we could use to help develop or help the Russian government develop conservation plans for tigers.
All right, and this happened in 2009. And how old were you at that time?
I was 43 years old, and I'd been living in Russia since 1995.
Let's set the scene for where this happened. You were camping. How remote was this area, and where was it?
It's a pretty remote area in far southeastern Russia, so near the border with North Korea and China. In fact, we could walk to the Chinese border from our camp. And it was at the end of I don't even know if you could call it a road, but a long dirt road that took about 5 hours to drive in there, but a really rough road. We had a 4-wheel drive vehicles with winches and sometimes a Russian military style vehicle just to get in there.
What was a typical day?
So we were capturing tigers and leopards in order to fit them with radio collars. And we'd set up a remote camp, a fairly large camp with a cook tent and a shower tent and all that. And we're going to be there for about 2 months. And so from our campsite, we had 3 different trap lines going out that we would check every day. And the way we captured tigers were in these cable foot snares. So a piece of aircraft grade cable that's attached to a tree at one end has a loop at the other end that sits over a spring so that when the tiger steps through the loop onto the spring would pull the snare up and tight around the tiger's leg. On every snare, we had a radio transmitter, and we would monitor for the signals from those transmitters 24/7. So if we got a signal in the middle of the night, we'd go hike into the woods to check the snare and see if we caught something.
Okay. So the idea was to immobilize the tiger, or maybe not immobilize, that might not be the right word, but to trap the tiger or the leopard to put a radio collar on them.
Yes, that's correct. So when we got an animal in a snare, we'd have to go in and use a dart gun to shoot it with a anesthesia dart. And
that's the immobilized part, right?
Yeah, well, immobilize is correct too. We usually say anesthetize or immobilize.
And how many people were you? You were the leader of this group. How many were on your team?
Yeah, there were, including myself, there were 6 of us normally in camp. And the reason for that was we needed at least 6 people because every day, even though we had radio transmitters on the snares, every day in the morning we would go out and check our snare lines just to be sure in case something went wrong and we had an animal that and the transmitter didn't work. So when we always did that in pairs, just for safety reasons.
Yeah, because you don't want an animal that's trapped and no one attending to it, or you're not knowing about it.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. So that day you started out at a disadvantage because you were short-handed. What was going on there?
One of my students had to go into Vladivostok to take exams. So she had left the day before, would take her exams that morning and come back that evening. So we were short one person. That meant that one of us had to go alone to check the snares, or to check one snare line. And me being the most experienced person on the team, I chose to go by myself to check my snare line.
Yeah, that's logical. You wouldn't have changed that decision looking back on it, right?
Oh, not at all. And in fact, that morning when I got up and stumbled into the cook tent bright and early before my coffee, one of my other students asked me, "Hey, John, can I go check we called it the road line because it went down an old logging road. Can I check the road line today?" And I said, "Sure, Dina, whatever." And a few minutes later, I remembered, no, we're short a person, and the road line was the easiest line. So that was the one that would be checked by me alone. And so I said, "No, you can't go alone to check a snare line. You don't have enough experience yet." And she got kind of upset about that, but later was very happy that I had made that decision. So
that was a critical decision on your part, not even knowing it at the time, even though you understood the safety aspect of it, but not knowing what would happen. Yeah. What was the weather like that morning?
Oh, it's a beautiful day. Autumn in the Russian Far East it's kind of like autumn in New England here in the U.S. Just beautiful. You get those really nice, crisp, clear fall days. Temperatures just below freezing. So, we had the leaves changing, beautiful reds and golds, and all I remember the maple leaves, the beautiful Japanese maples just get this really fiery red, and their leaves were edged with a nice frost, and just a wonderful day. Not a breath of wind.
And there was another factor in this equation. There were some visitors in the camp.
Yes, my wife and my 1.5-year-old daughter, Irina, is my wife, and Nina, my daughter, were in camp visiting. So they obviously didn't take them to check snares. They stayed back in camp while we're out checking snares.
And that's one of the unusual aspects of this. Each team going out to check a snare had a radio, but you couldn't communicate with the other teams. Is that right?
That's correct. And in some cases we could, but with walkie-talkie communication, it's line of sight. And so if somebody's over a ridge or something like that, you may not hear them, but all teams could communicate back to camp. So Irina had a radio in camp, and she would coordinate among teams in case any calls came in.
Okay. So she could relay messages between if you needed,
yes.
and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So you got your coffee. You started walking down the road. Can you just take us through what happened?
Yeah, so it's, like I said, a beautiful morning. I've got my coffee in my hand, and, you're not expecting to catch anything in this situation. There's no signals from the transmitters. And, in a 2-month session, we're happy if we caught one tiger. So the chances of having anything in a snare is really slim. So I'm just kind of wandering down the trail, enjoying a nice, beautiful morning. And
how far was it? How far away was it?
It was about 2 kilometers, so maybe a half-hour walk one way. And so just kind of wandering along with my coffee, enjoying the day, and, lovely way to start the day, taking your coffee on a short walk in a beautiful forest.
Did you have any, I almost feel silly asking this, but do you have any sense of doom or something not quite right, anything like that?
No, absolutely not. Just a typical day like any other day, going out to check the snares, and you go out and check the snares. There's nothing there, and you come back and meet with the team and have breakfast.
So checking it was, you almost look at it kind of like a formality.
Yeah, it was a box ticking exercise, really. So I'm walking down the trail, and as I approached the last snare, before I could see it, I heard a growl. I knew immediately that we had a tiger. I thought, wow, great, we've got a tiger. So I stopped, I put my coffee down, and I needed to approach that tiger, get a look at it, see what we had, so then I could go back to camp, meet with the team, and we would go in to anesthetize the animal. But I needed to know, was it a male, was it a female, how big was it, so we could calculate the drug dosage. So I put my coffee down. I carried a flare with me for safety, and it's a marine signal flare that you pull a string and it lights, but doesn't shoot a flare into the air. It just burns in your hand. And so if an animal is attacking you, you can hopefully hold it out and divert the charge. So I got my flare ready and started to approach the snare. When I was about 40 yards away, maybe, the tiger did what pretty much all tigers do in a snare when you approach. He jumped up and he tried to run away. And immediately I thought, oh, wow, it's a nice male tiger. Great. And I was already starting to back away. Don't want to stress the animal out any more than needed. And of course, when he tried to run away, he hit the end of the snare and he came up short, kind of like a dog hitting the end of his chain. And
let me ask you just for a second. You said that you had this flare and that was for your defense, but how could a trapped tiger be a threat to you? I mean, was there a chance it could escape the trap? Or were you considering that possibility?
Yeah, there's always a chance they can escape the trap. There's always the chance that maybe you've got a cub in the trap and its mom was the one that was growling at me. Or, there's all kinds of things that can happen. And there's bears out there and leopards out there. So you never really know what you're going to meet. But really, our biggest concern is the tiger popping out of the trap and coming after us.
So you could see that it was an adult male tiger. How big? What would you estimate the weight?
Adult males would run 375 to up to the biggest we ever caught was 450 pounds. So probably around 400 pounds.
That is huge.
Yeah, they're big animals.
Wow. He tries to run away. Then what?
Then he did what all tigers do when they can't run away, and he turned around and he charged. And that was expected, and I expect to see him hit the end of the cable and come up short, but he didn't. And I recognized that immediately, that he didn't hit the end of the cable, and he's coming for me. I popped my flare, and they get burning quite quickly, but it, for me, time really, it just slowed down. Here's the situation I've been dreading for the past more than 10 years, was happening now, and it was happening while I was alone in the woods. So I popped my flare, and I'm holding it out in front of me, and it's fizzling and sparking. Well, here comes this tiger just coming for me with all his might, huge platter-sized paws, just reaching out for me with every lunge, claws extended, popping his jaws and making this kind of roar, 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 roar sound, and 3-inch long canines. He's trying to look as fierce as he can and displaying all his weaponry as he's coming at me. And my only thought was, he's not stopping. I'd been charged by tigers a number of times before, and I knew this was the real thing. This was no bluff. He was not going to stop. And I didn't think my flare was going to deter him. And so he's just lunging towards me, and my flare finally gets going and holding it out in front of me. And very briefly, he finally just kind of disappeared behind the flame of the flare, but just as quickly reappeared through the flame of the flare, kind of like a circus tiger jumping through a flaming hoop. And then bam, 400 pounds of tigers, probably moving 35 miles an hour, just slammed right into my chest. And he carried me about 10 yards back and just slammed me into the ground. And then I'm lying on my back. He's literally standing on my shoulders. I have a scratch on my left shoulder from that, and roaring right into my face. And so I put my left hand up kind of defensively, and he just started biting it, just like a stapler, just bite, 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 bite. I feel bones crunching. I don't remember feeling pain at the time, but it was pretty nasty. But I realized I still had my flare in my right hand. So I took my flare and I kind of jammed it up under his chin. I didn't want to hit him in the eye and risk blinding him or something, or really injuring him. I just jammed that flare up under his chin, the side of his face.
I got to ask you about that part, because, I mean, you're a tiger, a 400-pound tiger is on top of you, biting your hand, and you're thinking, where should I put the flare? I don't want to blind him. It seems like such a sense of awareness that I wouldn't imagine that anyone would have in that adrenaline-filled situation.
Yeah, it came from two things, and really I wouldn't even say I was thinking. I don't remember conscious thoughts going through my mind as that was happening. But what it was just instinct. Having thought about this situation over and over again for the past, I've been there, 14 years doing this. And so it was just instinct. And two things. One, I have a passion for protecting wildlife. I don't want to hurt them. And two, the only thing worse than being attacked by a tiger is being attacked by a wounded tiger. So if I jammed it into one of his eyes, I've got a half-blind tiger. That's probably not going to be a better situation for me. It's probably going to be worse. So that's where I was coming from.
So you got the flare, and how did you use it?
I just jammed it up under the side of his chin, and as soon as that flare hit him, he just took off running, just like a shot. Just as quickly as he came, he was gone, and it was equally as impressive watching him run away. He ran up an almost vertical slope, and just the power and speed with which he did that was mind-blowing. But then the tiger's gone, and so I stood up, and to assess my injuries, of course, my hand was most immediate. I looked at that, and I kind of thought, well, that looks pretty bad, but it's not life-threatening. It's not really bleeding very much. And I felt a sting on the inside of my left thigh, and I thought, my gosh, femoral artery. I looked down, there's a rip in my pants, but no blood. So I didn't even bother trying to look any further at that. And I thought, my gosh, I'm okay. I didn't really expect to survive this, right? And then, I'm just pumping with adrenaline, and adrenaline makes you fight or flight. Well, I started with fight, but tiger's gone, the fight turned to flight, and I just turned around and ran. Again, not really even thinking much, but what if he comes back, I guess? Or what if there's another tiger around? What if I was wrong and it's really a female and she's got cubs that she's trying to protect, something like that. So I just took off running down the trail.
Do you think you were in shock at that time?
Not really. I think by that time, I think when the tiger was charging me, nothing was going on in my mind, which contrasted with other times I've been charged where a lot was going through my mind. The only thought I really had was he's not stopping. But by that point, a lot was going through my mind. I'm thinking about all these things. But as I was running down the trail and I started to get out of breath, I did start to become shocky. And I started to get lightheaded, and the world was starting to kind of, the periphery of my vision was kind of graying in and closing in around me. I thought, oh my gosh, I just survived a tiger attack, and now I'm going to go into shock and die out here in the woods alone after surviving a tiger attack. This can't happen. So I stopped, and I put my head down between my legs to try to increase blood flow to my brain. And I just started yelling just to try to bring myself around, which worked pretty quickly. Within probably 15 seconds or 30 seconds, I was okay again. And so I stood up and just started walking down the trail quickly. But Irina was back in camp, and she's waking up in the tent, changing Nina's diapers, and hears all this yelling. And so she immediately jumps on the radio and says, "What's all the yelling in the forest?" And the other two teams immediately respond, "What do you mean yelling? We don't hear anything." But I'd lost my radio in the fight with the tiger. So of course I didn't respond. So she just panics, gets Nina's diaper on, and goes running out of camp. So I'm about 200 yards from camp, coming down the trail, and here comes Irina and Nina bouncing on her shoulders, running down the trail towards me. And I'm like, it's okay. Okay.
Man, what if you were being chased by the tiger at the time?
Right. And it's, definitely not the situation that you want. Fortunately, I wasn't. So it was all good.
Yeah.
And we walked back to camp.
So what's the first step? Obviously, you need medical attention. And the other teams still weren't at camp, right?
Yeah, they got back to camp pretty quickly. And we had a veterinarian on the team. We always had a veterinarian with us when doing capture work. And he was a good friend, John Lewis. And he immediately took care of my hand, did the basic first aid that he could on my hand, and then got in the vehicle and drove to the hospital in Vladivostok to get properly cared for.
How far away is the hospital?
It took us 5 or 6 hours probably to get there, mostly because the road was so bad. Distance-wise, it was probably, less than 100 miles.
That's still a long way to go when you're in pain. Or how much pain were you in at that time?
I was in a lot of pain. And John Lewis later made fun of me. He's like, yeah, Goodrich, you weren't very stoic. Because when he was doing the bandaging up my hand, I was yelling. That pain kind of subsided, but I was still in a lot of pain the whole trip. But it wasn't that, by that point, it wasn't that big of a deal.
I'm trying to picture if your injuries were different, like if you had a broken leg and going 100 miles over bumpy roads, that would have been 10 times worse, probably.
Yeah. And if that were the situation, we might have considered calling in a helicopter, which would have been an option for us.
You're going to a Russian hospital. I have no idea what would you expect there, or did you know what to expect?
I knew more or less what to expect because my wife had suffered a really bad bus accident, actually in the run up to her first date. So, and she spent a couple of months.
Sounds like a whole other story there.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it is a whole nother story. And she spent a couple of months in the hospital with a broken neck. So I was intimately familiar with the medical system in that hospital in Vladivostok. I knew the hospital would be dirty. I knew it would be disorganized, but I also knew that they had some pretty good doctors. And it was a decision for me I could have flown back to the U.S. to get medical attention. But after the initial assessment at the hospital and a proposal from a doctor to how he wanted to deal with my hand, I was okay with staying in Russia to have the work done.
What was the actual assessment of your hand? Obviously broken bones, but I mean, were they able to make it functional again?
Yeah. Well, in the way things worked at the hospital, I started out with going to essentially the emergency room where I was assessed by a young doctor who was just doing the quick assessment. What do we need to do with you?
Triage.
Yeah, kind of the triage, which was pretty amusing. It was just I stood in a long line, waited my turn, went in. What happened to you? I was attacked by a tiger. Wow. So he looks over my hand and says, do you have any other injuries? And we're just sitting in chairs. So I said, yes, got something on the inside of my thigh. I said, okay, let's see. So I pull my pants down and the first thing he said was, wow, I'm impressed. Your underwear are clean.
He didn't expect to see that after a tiger attack, huh?
Yeah, and he was a bit of a comedian, but it really broke the ice and made me feel at ease. So, but yeah, it was just a small laceration on the inside of my thigh. So he sent me off to be treated. So then I had to go into an initial surgery where I guess they first x-rayed my hand, but then they got in there and did some initial cleaning up. For that, they actually anesthetized me with ketamine, which was a drug that I was very familiar with using on tigers, and before that in different research projects, badgers and bears. I'd literally anesthetized hundreds of animals with ketamine. So I was very familiar with it and knew how safe it was. And of course, going under anesthesia in a foreign hospital is a little bit scary, but that really helped put me at ease because I knew what I was up against and that it's really hard to kill somebody with ketamine.
You had some interaction with the nurses there.
As I'm lying on the table and they're preparing to do the initial work on my hand, the nurses were flirting with me and all, oh, an American, he was attacked by a tiger, how exciting. Well, and which was this is so typical of my previous experiences in Russia. It just kind of made me laugh, and I just kind of went along with it and had fun with it. And there's nothing more to it than that, but it made it kind of fun. And then I was able to talk with the anesthesiologist about the ketamine and ask him if anything else in there or anything like that, and told him of my experiences. And so that was kind of nice. And then they put me under, did the initial cleanup of my hand. There were some bone fragments missing, but they just did the best they could. But before they did surgery to really repair my hand, they wanted to wait for a couple of weeks to ensure that there was no infection. So they put me on heavy antibiotics and really made sure that we were past any danger of infection before they went in there. And ultimately they did another surgery and had to take some bone from my hip and transplant it into my hand. And then I ended up with a titanium splint. The tiger had bitten clean through my hand 5 or 6 times. So it was pretty messed up.
So you had to leave and then you went back to camp and then came back 2 weeks later?
Yeah, I actually spent several days in the hospital. I don't remember how many, and then left the hospital and went back out to camp. And they had brought in another person in my place to help keep running the snare lines. Went back out and worked for another week or so, and then went back in and had the surgery on my hand.
Was the surgery successful?
Yeah, not 100%. And where things, like I said, the doctor, I was confident when I felt like he was really good, and I felt like he knew what he was doing and would do a good job with it. And he did. And I've since had it examined by a doctor in the US who said, yeah, he did a bang up job. But where things fell apart was the follow up. And what I really needed was some fairly rigorous physical therapy to get my hand working 100% again. And it could have happened that way, but it didn't. He didn't follow up. He gave me some kind of vague instructions. But what happened was the knuckle in my ring finger ended up freezing because I didn't go through that physical therapy to get it bending again. So that knuckle is frozen, but I kind of figure that getting attacked by a 400-pound tiger and that's all I have to live with, that's fine.
Is it the knuckle at the base of your finger or?
Yep.
Okay. So is your finger's just locked in the open position? Is that right? Or is it locked down?
It's locked in that knuckle is locked in the open position.
Okay.
Because I'd had a splint on it for several weeks holding that finger out straight.
Okay. So you just can't bend that finger.
Yeah.
It sounds to me like if you didn't have that flare in your right hand, you probably wouldn't be here today.
I would probably be dead, almost certainly. Absolutely.
That's amazing. And I wouldn't think of that as being the primary defense against a huge tiger. But you don't want to use a gun, obviously. You don't want to kill the animal. But yet, using a flare like that, since it doesn't shoot anything, you've got to be within arm's length of the attacker for it to be effective. But you were aware of that, though.
Yeah, normally I would carry both a can of bear spray and a flare. I didn't have my bear spray because Arena and Nina were alone back in camp. So I'd left my bear spray with her just in case. So all I had was my flare, and that was my normal setup, to have a bear spray and a flare every time I was going out into the field, regardless of whether we were trapping or whatever, because there's always the chance to meet with tigers there's brown bears, there's Asiatic black bears, there's leopards, and wild boar. So a lot could go wrong. And I always thought that the pepper spray would be good at deterring a charge. It sprays about 7 yards out in front of you, and hopefully that would turn a tiger. And actually, I'd used it on tigers twice successfully prior to that, and so I knew that it worked. But I always thought the flare might not be as good of a deterrent, but it would be a good weapon if you've got an animal on top of you and you're having a fight and you need to defend yourself. And indeed, it turned out that it was superb for that. There were times during the project where the Russian government actually required us to carry a gun with us for protection. I didn't like the guns, not only because I didn't want to have to kill an animal, but because I wasn't confident in my or anyone else's ability to make that shot. Because if you got an animal charging you, you need to kill it. Because like I said before, the only thing worse than being attacked by a healthy animal is being attacked by a wounded animal. And making that kill shot, which you need to put a bullet in the head of an animal that's coming at you at 30 miles an hour, that takes good marksmanship, a bit of luck, and nerves of steel. So I was much more comfortable with a flare and a pepper spray.
With a firearm, the adrenaline factor, it seems like that would reduce accuracy substantially.
I'd imagine, yeah. You'd need someone really solid in that situation.
Your work today is with an organization, Panthera. What is that?
Yeah, so Panthera is a medium-sized NGO and the only organization in the world that is entirely dedicated to protecting the world's sporty wildcat species.
So what's a typical day like for you now?
Lots of meetings. So I started with Panthera as their tiger program director. And when I was doing that, it was lots of travel to different tiger range states, helping to set up projects helping to implement and run projects for tiger conservation to help protect tigers. More recently, I've become chief scientist for Panthera. So I do have quite a bit of traveling around the world to different countries where we have projects, and lots of time in meetings, both online and in person.
And this is just for my own curiosity, but I saw something that you wrote. You mentioned a connection between wildcats and climate change. What is that connection?
The connection between wildcats and climate change and how we can use wildcats to help us mitigate climate change is that wildcats are a great indicator species and they're great ambassadors for conservation. And so what do I mean by indicator species? So cats require very large areas. So for example, to contain a viable population of tigers in Southeast Asia, you're looking at thousands of square miles of habitat needed, contiguous, healthy habitat to protect a tiger population. So if you've got thousands of square kilometers of rainforest with a healthy tiger population, you know that most of the other species in that rainforest are also doing well. You have a really nice big chunk of forest, so you're protecting biodiversity and you're protecting those carbon stocks that are held in that forest and the value of the forest in pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Beyond that, tigers and wildcats in general are also good, what we call flagship species. People love cats. People love tigers. Tigers indeed were voted by, it was a survey run, I think, by the BBC probably 20 years ago now, but in lots of different countries, tigers were voted the most favorite animal in that survey, above and beyond domestic dogs and domestic horses. So here you have an animal that the public can really get behind. You know, it's hard. It's hard for the public, it's hard for governments to really get behind complex issues like climate change and biodiversity and to really understand how to address those issues. If we can package that into tiger conservation, for example, then you're really simplifying the equation, and simplifying the equation, especially for governments that have to implement the measures. But if you can go to them and say, listen, if you have healthy tiger populations throughout all the existing habitat in your country, you're doing it. It means you've got the climate protection you need. You've got the biodiversity protection that you need in place, and it's working. And then for all the signatories to climate treaties, to biodiversity treaties, they have to monitor that and show that they are making progress towards those climate goals or towards those biodiversity goals. Well, that can get really, if you're talking about biodiversity, what are they going to go out and count every species of plant and animal out there to show that their populations aren't declining? No. If they can go out and count tigers, which we're very good at, we know how to do, that can be a good proxy to show that other species are healthy and doing well and the forest is healthy and doing well.
So that's the indicator factor that goes right into it. Okay. Yeah, I read that over the last 100 years, tigers have decreased globally from around 100,000 to about 4,500. That just seems drastic and alarming. Is that starting to turn around now, or is it still going down?
It is starting to turn around, and it is drastic and alarming. Tigers are an endangered species. They were really on the brink of extinction. And thanks to really 2 decades of strong efforts by governments and non-government organizations like Panthera, we've seemed to have turned the tide, at least for parts of tiger range. So tigers are doing pretty well in South Asia, in India, and Nepal, and Bhutan, Bangladesh. Not doing as well in Southeast Asia. That's the area where we're still most concerned. Since the turn of the century, tigers have gone extinct from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but we still have tigers in Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia on the island of Sumatra. We still have tigers in those countries, and it seems like we're turning the tide in those countries, and tiger numbers are more or less stable, at least in Malaysia and Thailand, but tiger numbers are still very low in Southeast Asia, and we're very concerned. And the reason for that is habitat loss and poaching. The most urgent threat right now is poaching of tigers largely for the traditional Chinese medicine market. poaching is so bad. It is the reason that we lost tigers from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam in the first decade of this century. And it is the reason that we have over 1 million square kilometers of vacant tiger habitat out there. That is to say, we have good habitat, no tigers in it, because the tigers and their prey have been poached out of those habitats. And Southeast Asia has some of the highest deforestation rates in the world, which means tiger habitat is disappearing very rapidly. But despite that huge threat, poaching is still by far and away the most urgent threat there.
Well, for someone like you who loves the big cats, this has to be some of the most gratifying work. This is your life mission.
It is gratifying because we are making progress. So in 2015, when tigers were assessed by the IUCN, I led the assessment for the IUCN Red List, which then classifies them as, the assessment would classify them as critically endangered, vulnerable, and so on. Tigers were classified as endangered in that 2015 assessment, and we estimated there were about 3,200 tigers in the wild. In 2022, we again assessed tigers, and I again led that assessment, and we estimated that there are about 4,500 tigers in the wild. Now, that increase may be real or it may be not. It may just be because we've gotten really good at counting tigers, and over the past 10 or 20 years, much better as time goes on. So we might be better at counting tigers and covering more area. But we are confident that at least range-wide, tiger populations haven't declined in the past 7 years since 2015. And indeed, in some areas, we know for sure that they are increasing. Some protected areas in India, some protected areas in Nepal have shown very marked increases in tiger numbers.
Well, that's good. We appreciate your work.
Oh, thank you.
For people listening to this, is there anything the average listener can do to help you in this mission?
Absolutely. And the easiest answer is donate. Panthera needs donations. All the organizations working on tiger conservation or wildcat conservation in general need the public support and those donations to continue. And a lot of that money ends up going through range state governments to support their conservation activities. But beyond just donating, engage with policy and the government to support legislation that promotes international conservation, promotes biodiversity conservation, promotes climate conservation. In our case for Panthera, especially that promotes cat conservation.
It's the old phrase, think globally, act locally, right?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, and so the website is panthera.org, and we'll have a link to that in the episode notes. And should people want to contact you, how would they do that? Through the website?
Yes, they can there's an info@panthera.org email address that would end up in my hands eventually if it was written specifically to me. So.
Thanks for sharing your story. I'm glad you had that flair with you.
Thank you, Scott. I really enjoyed it.
In the episode notes, you can see a picture of John with one of his tigers while it was sedated. It's a really beautiful animal, and it's huge. And I have links to Panthera if you'd like to get more information. That's all at whatwasthatlike.com/178. Got a voicemail about a recent episode. This listener heard episode 175 titled Mike Wears an Ostomy Pouch.
Hey Scott, my name's Hannah. I'm calling from Indiana. I'm calling in regards to the episode 175 about the guy with the ostomy bag. I just wanted to say thank you for the episode. It was a wonderful listen, and I wanted to call and show in my support for more episodes like this. There are a lot of health issues and disabilities that I have questions about, but I don't have anyone in my life that I really feel comfortable directly asking. So I wanted to ask, please continue to share stories of people with altered bodies. And I wanted to say that I do find them as compelling as stories from people who survived traumas or accidents or even have personal triumphs. So yeah, thank you so much for all of your work.
And guess what? Raw audio episode 41 has just been released. 41 episodes available to binge now. In this episode, a husband shoots some family members in an argument over leaving the lights on.
You shot him? Yes, I shot him and his mother. He's still alive right now, but his mother's not. I don't know. She could be alive. I don't know.
An animal trainer is attacked by a whale.
We actually have a trainer in the water with one of our whales, the whale that they're not supposed to be in the water with.
Okay.
So we don't know what's going on.
And a teenager butt dials 911 while burglarizing a car.
Remember with your phone? Oh, I think so. You gotta break the SIM card. Take that SIM card out. They can trace it.
By supporting the show, you get access to all 41 of the raw audio episodes, and you get every regular episode of the podcast ad-free. On an iPhone, just go to What Was That Like and click on Try Free. On Android, go to whatwasthatlike.com/plus to try it out at no cost. Graphics for this episode were created by Bob Bretz. Full episode transcription was created by James Lai. And now we have this week's listener story. And it's in keeping with the theme of today's episode. And I didn't even plan that. Do you have a story of something interesting or unusual that you can tell in about 5 to 10 minutes? Well, we all want to hear it. Just record it on your phone and email it to me, scott@whatwasthatlike.com. This one is another story about an encounter with a large animal. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.
I'm an avid outdoorsman, and I enjoy hiking, fishing, mountain biking, camping, and backpacking, and this story takes place on a solo backpack trip in Montana in the 1st of June. Winters around here can feel long when anticipating adventures in the high country. Snow collects and blocks easy access into the back roads that don't get plowed or maintained during the winter months. Camping for me is a year-round occurrence, however, this lack of access to the high country limits my backpack trips in these areas. So once the snow melts and the roads begin to open, I'm ready to go with many adventurous plans. This year, my first backpack trip in June was into a high mountain lake near the border between Idaho and Montana. Sunday morning came and I got into the road early and arrived at the trailhead without event. This trip was just myself and my 40-pound rescue dog, Cedar. The hike into the lake was short, around 3 miles. However, nobody had been into this lake since the previous year. Wind-blown trees crossed the trail every 50 feet or so, and progress was slow. Over, under, and around these trees was slow going, as was traversing over the top of large snowdrifts blocking the trail. After 2 hours or so, fighting through these obstacles uphill, I finally came to a clearing at the lake shore and was amazed at the beauty in front of me. The lake sat in a basin with mountains on all sides, except for where the stream outlet left the lake shore and flowed downhill in the direction from where I came. All around me, large snow patches remained, and the melting snowpack caused numerous waterfalls to cascade into the lake. These waterfalls were almost on all sides of me, and the beauty and sound was mesmerizing. This is what I had come for: beauty, solace, and personal reflection. Excited to spend time relaxing in this beautiful arena, I hurried to get chores done first. I set up my tent and rolled my sleeping bag, collected firewood, made and ate lunch, and pumped water to refill my canteens. Now I was really ready to take in nature's beauty and observe the wonderful landscape until the sun went down behind the mountains. I took my backpack chair down to the lake, along with binoculars and a beer. I had carried that one beer as a personal reward to enjoy after camp was set up. So, beer cracked and pressed to my lips, I looked out across the lake to the mountains on the far side. So relaxing. How blessed I felt to be at this location. My eyes followed along the top of the largest waterfall and came to rest on a dark object way up on the mountainside. Setting down my beer, binoculars in hand, I focused and saw a black bear slowly emerging from a cave. Absolutely beautiful to see this creature on top of what I'd already witnessed earlier. As I watched, the bear slowly made his way downhill in my direction toward the tree line and finally disappeared out of sight. No worry, though, I thought. I was carrying both bear spray and a .44, and I felt prepared. I sat there for another 15 minutes or so until I started to really focus on wondering where the bear had gone. As I had pondered what the bear was doing, I started to think about how the bear had likely come out of hibernation very recently, if not when I saw him. My mind started to replay stories I had heard of people being harassed by skinny, hungry bears that had come out of hibernation recently, motivated to regain weight. Although prepared for a worst, a conflict with a bear was the last on my to-do list that day, and not being able to fully relax in camp, I made a decision. I reluctantly rested on the decision to pack up and car camp at the trailhead. Besides, the other 5 beers in my 6-pack were in my car. And so I shoved my gear back into my backpack and started the descent with Cedar out in front, running back and forth, loving life and exploring and smelling everything she could. Progress downhill was slow, and I took careful attention to watch every footfall as I picked through the trees in the snow. Snowfall was melting and falling onto the trail ahead of me, and as it hit some rocks around a corner from me, the sound muffled any other noises within my immediate vicinity. As I neared this water, my head was down, focusing on the trail, when I heard a whoomp, 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 and I look up in time to see a full-grown bear running directly towards me down the trail at full speed. Each time I hear a whoomp, the bear's feet are landing as he's breathing hard and hauling ass directly towards me. Because of the water noise and my focus on my feet, by the time I had heard the bear and looked up, he's probably 20 feet or so away from me and closing the gap alarmingly fast. There was simply no time to reach for the bear spray on my hip or the 44 on my chest. In fact, he was moving so fast that I didn't even have time to drop the beer I was still holding and grab a defense item. All I had time to do was yell, "Hey!" at the top of my lungs. I guess this yelling started the bear, and he brushed past me downhill, off the trail, and into the bushes as fast as he could go. When he left the trail, he was about 5 feet from me, still at an all-out sprint, and I could feel the wind on my face as he careened by. Couple or more bounds, and he was gone, and I just thought to myself, well, I guess that just happened. It happened so fast and was over so quickly, my heart rate did not have time to rise. I stood there, heartbeat steady, hands calm, surprised by what I saw, when my rescue dog comes trotting down the trail towards me with that same demeanor of, "Hey, you still coming?" I still wonder how that bear got around my dog. If he was running from Cedar, you would think he would have continued downhill in the opposite direction of my dog. Was the bear after me until my loud yell changed his mind? I guess I will never fully know, but I will say that if you are in bear country, you better see them first because they can close the gap surprisingly quick, considering how big they are. Take care.